So let's go to the next section, which will be about separating financing contracts. So what do we mean by that? Well, we have been looking at pooling so far. So we have considered pooling equilibrium, as it is called, which essentially was an equilibrium, a financing situation in which both the good quality entrepreneur and, on the other hand, the bad quality entrepreneur, they both get the same contract, in the sense that they get the same decision about payoffs if they are successful, the same RB we had in the previous example. And we saw actually that those who actually do know of themselves that they have a good contract, a good project, that they will be worse off than if they could persuade the investors that their project actually is good, whereas the bad quality project entrepreneurs were actually better off in this pooling equilibrium. Seeing this, we might actually anticipate that if you are a good entrepreneur yourself, you might like to find a way in which you can separate yourself. So prove to the investors that you actually do have a good project. And we're going to get to this now. This is going to be called a separating equilibrium. So we're going to look at a situation in which the two types of entrepreneurs, the good one and the bad one, will succeed in getting different contracts from the investors, because they can somehow persuade the investors, especially the good ones, can persuade the investors that they actually do have a good quality project. So what this good quality entrepreneur will want to do is somehow to be able to send a signal that is going to persuade the investor that indeed this particular project or this particular entrepreneur is really of good type, rather than just claims to be of the good type. So the signal has to be informative. So an informative signal would help bringing to fruition such a separating equilibrium, sustaining such a separating equilibrium. The question we'd like to answer here is, can we design some scheme in which indeed this good quality entrepreneur can signal that she is a good entrepreneur? It turns out that we will need there that this signal is going to be costly, but must not be so costly as to lose any profitability for the investor and for the entrepreneur. And the signal, on the other hand, must succeed in really separating these two types of entrepreneurs. So the bad entrepreneur should not be willing to mimic that signal, so to send the signal even though she's bad. So what kinds of signals will we have in mind? Well, we'll study two such schemes, and there are a couple more in Tirol. You can have a look at those. But the two schemes that we'll focus on in the lecture is, on one hand, costly collateral. So you post collateral with the loan that you take. And the second one will be about incomplete insurance. We'll see what that is later on. And the common theme of these two dissipative signals is that it's costly. Well, that's what dissipative actually means. It's inefficient. There's some profit is going to be lost here because of some inefficiency. But this inefficiency is necessary because it's going to be more costly for a bad type to send such a signal, to create such a signal, than for the good type. And that's going to sustain this equilibrium. So let's have a look what we mean in practice. So let's have a look first at this costly collateral as a dissipative signal for good type and good quality entrepreneurs. So here you see picture. So this picture is actually from a play, a Shakespeare play. It's from the Merchant of Venice. And who you see here in this play, in the middle, the guy sitting down, that's the merchant Antonio in Venice, who wanted to borrow some money on the back of some profitable shiploads of spices that he was expecting in the coming months to come in. He was actually borrowing some money for a friend of his. And where did they go to borrow this money? Well, to the money lender, who is Shylock. So Shylock is the guy on the right, who might recognize Al Pacino. So he's the money lender. And he had the following scheme that he proposed to Antonio. He said, well, okay, I'm willing to lend this money to you. And you will pay me back in 2 months, but I'm not completely sure that these ships will be coming in. But of course, you have better information, but let's just say the following. If they won't come in, so if you will not repay me, then I'm entitled to take a pound of your flesh from your body, essentially. So you see actually already the knife in his hand, because he's ready here to take this flesh, because it turned out the ships appear to have been shipwrecked. So the ships were not coming in. And this picture that we see here is actually the court case. And you see Portia on the left, she poses as a lawyer here. So the point of this picture, of this example, is this Antonio was so certain that he was a good borrower, he was sure to be able to repay Shylock. He wanted to convince him by agreeing to this sort of ludicrous terms of, this is not going to happen to me, he thought. I'm good for my money, I will pay back this Shylock. I have all these ships coming in. But in the end, actually, he was unlucky. At least it looked like he was going to be unlucky. You will see in the end, if you read the play, everything turns out to be fine after all, at least for Antonio. But he was unlucky, and he was going to lose this flesh. So he thought, I'm good for my money. There's no problem for me for offering this pound of my flesh, because I'm not at risk of losing this at all. Was what his thinking at the time of making writing this contract with Shylock. So what you see here is this Antonio was willing to make a commitment to make a payment in terms of his flesh in the unlikely outcome of failure to repay the debt. He himself was sure he was going to be able to repay the debt. He was willing to make this repayment in terms of flesh, even though the flesh itself might be not so useful to Shylock, but it would be very harmful to himself. Because he said, well, this will demonstrate that I'm a very reliable borrower. So this is what collateral is. You are willing to post collateral to make sure that the bank or the lender is going to accept that you apparently know or believe that you will actually pay back this debt. So how do we now go back to more regular finance? I'd say we look at costly collateral. So the entrepreneur that we have has some assets C. So in our example of Antonio, his assets C were his flesh, his pound of flesh. That's how you can view this. So this pound of flesh, or the assets C in reality, have no value to the investor, or perhaps little value to the investor. We're going to assume in the model they have no value at all to the investor, but extremely valuable to the entrepreneur, right? So he would perhaps die by giving up this pound of flesh in the Shakespeare example. So what's going to happen is the entrepreneur is going to offer the collateral as a compensation to the investor if the project fails. Now, regular collateral, of course, is not like a pound of flesh, but might be, say, your house. So if I'm making a loan from a bank, I might put up my house as a collateral to the bank. Not because I think that the people in the bank would like to live in my house. So I'm sure that I like living in my own house much more than anybody at this bank does. But just to demonstrate to the bank that I'm fairly assured that I can actually repay them. And that's what collateral does. And if you're a manager, it might not be something sort of tangible. It could also be your job. So if you're a manager and you want to say, oh, I'm actually a good manager, I'm going to turn this company around and make it profitable again. And if I can't, I'm going to make it very easy for you to fire me. So the collateral here would be the job. So if you're very unsure of yourself, you might not be so willing to make it very easy for you for the investors to fire you as a manager. But if you're pretty confident, then you might actually put your job on the line, literally, in making it easy for the principals, the lenders, the financiers, to sack you if you fail. So C is something again that is of value to the manager or the agent, him or herself, or the entrepreneur, but not so much to the lenders, to the financiers, to the principals. So then the model will be this. So if there is success, which if you're a good type, have a good project, will occur with probability P, then you'll negotiate in the contract some repayment RG, just like we had in the simple example before. But now if you fail, you agree to give up this collateral. So if you're a good type, you post a certain amount of collateral, say your house, and that's going to be costly for you as entrepreneur. It's going to cost you CG, so the payoff is going to be minus C if you, and the G refers here to the contract that you'll post and the contract that you'll agree upon if you're a good type entrepreneur. Same way, you might also agree on a contract if you are a bad type, but these might now have different payments. So there might be a different payment RB, consistent with you having, well, perhaps a profitable but not bad profitable project. So there's a lower quality, or let's just call it a bad quality project. So RB typically will be lower than RG. But also the collateral that you post goes with the fact that you admit not having such a good project, so just have a different amount of collateral, we call that CB. So there will be two different contracts, one which is going to be aimed at the good type of entrepreneur, which will have a repayment upon success to the entrepreneur RG, but the collateral that is going to be damaged essentially to the entrepreneur of CG, whereas the bad entrepreneur is going to agree on a contract which has perhaps a lower payment RB upon success, but also perhaps a lower collateral, and we'll actually see it might often be a zero collateral CB in case of failure. So if this is going to be the equilibrium, which is what we're going to try to verify, so if this is going to be what happens, different contracts for the good types and for the bad types, the good types utility from entering into this contract, so the expected payment from this entering into this contract will, well, with probability P, they get RG, that's when success happens, and they know they are of the good type. Whereas with probability 1 minus P, there will be a failure and they will lose collateral. And likewise, if you're a bad type, then your utility is, well, you know you have a bad quality project, a lower quality project, so the only probability of success Q, but in that case you get RB, so Q times RB. Whereas if you fail, you will lose the CB, which is going to happen with probability 1 minus Q. So the idea here is going to be that pledging this collateral, so posting this collateral in as part of the agreement of the payoffs to the entrepreneur is going to be more expensive for a bad entrepreneur than for the good one, because for the bad entrepreneur, it's more likely that you lose your collateral, because it's more likely that you will fail. 1 minus Q is going to be bigger than 1 minus P. And that's going to be drive the results. So have a look at what these contracts might look like, and in particular we will want to figure out what do these RG, CG, RB, and CB, what do they need to be in order for this to be actually an equilibrium. Where by equilibrium we mean that everybody is essentially happy by sticking to those contracts. So we will want lenders to be satisfied that they will be repaid. We will want bad types to be satisfied with the contract that's designed for them, rather than preferring to pose as good types and getting these other payments upon success and failure. And also we would like these good types basically to be better off as a result of this, offering these different contracts with a higher RG, but perhaps also this collateral CG. So let's have a look at that. But let's go to the paper to actually do this. So let me again write down those two payoffs. So if you're a good type, you will look at the equilibrium for which there's an agreement on a payment to the borrower's RG upon success, and the loss in terms of the collateral that's given up, the house that changes hands, or the job that it's lost, or the flesh that's cut out of you, which is CG. So minus CG will be your payoff. Well, if you are the lower quality type, the bad type, you might have a different RB upon success, a lower RB, a lower return when there's success, but perhaps also a lower loss. You post less collateral or no collateral, CB, when you fail. And we'll figure out when is this going to be an equilibrium. The first thing that we want to look at as a benchmark is the one with symmetric information, or no asymmetric information. No asymmetric info. So the bank or the lender actually knows, can observe whether the project is good or bad. So there's no hidden information. So what would be, so it's easy to distinguish these two projects then. You can just look at this entrepreneur, you can see whether as a bank, whether they are good or bad. So you would offer, naturally would offer a different contract to the good entrepreneur than to the bad entrepreneur. Or what would these contracts look like? Well, there's going to be again competition among the various lenders. So lenders are going to break even. So the break even condition is going to be for the good types. Again, there is a probability of success P. And in this case, what do the lenders get? They get the total payoff R minus RG, which is the share that's going to the entrepreneurs. In case of failure, the entrepreneur is going to lose this collateral, but remember, we're assuming this collateral is not valuable at all for the lenders. So they might get this collateral, but they don't value it. So it has value 0. So it doesn't appear actually in their participation constraint. So this is going to be, sorry, not 0, but I, of course. So lenders get back their money. What does the borrower get? Well, they want to maximize what they can get. So they want to maximize their utility. The good type will maximize their utility, which is going to be P times RG, which is what they get if they win, if they are successful. But if they lose, if they fail, they're going to lose this collateral CG. And what they want to do is figure out an RG in the CG that's going to maximize this utility subject to the banks breaking even. So what does this? And the same thing actually goes for the bad type, but with suitable changes with RB and Q actually, where we have the RG and the P in this particular equations. So we can actually solve this because this tells us immediately what RG is. So RG equals, or P times RG perhaps, equals P times R minus I. So what CG should you agree to if there's perfect information, so no asymmetric information? Everybody knows you're of the good type. If you want to maximize the expression over here, P times RG, well, we know what that is from the participation constraint. That's PR minus I. minus 1 minus p times CG. I want to maximize this over this CG. When is this maximum? Well, clearly if I pose no collateral at all. So for CG, under perfect information, we would never want to post any collateral because it's of no value to the bank and it's only negative for the entrepreneur, and the bank can see anyway that this project is good. So of course RG is given by implicitly by this equation. So RG equals R minus I over P in this perfect information situation, and CG in this perfect information is going to be 0, and likewise for RB and CB. So that's the benchmark of no hidden information. Now we turn to the question when there is an information asymmetry. Information is hidden from the bank, so the bank cannot actually see this particular entrepreneur is a good quality entrepreneur rather than a bad quality entrepreneur. Well, then obviously offering this particular contract with some positive RG and a collateral which is going to be equal to 0 is not a wise thing to do for the bank, because low quality entrepreneurs will actually flock towards you and say, well, actually we also have these very nice high quality projects, and of course we don't want to post any collateral, but just believe us. And of course you won't believe them without this collateral, because you will lose money if you do so. So how can we now get around this? In this case, we would have to add one additional constraint. Additional constraint. Namely, we would like to write a contract. So if we are a really good type, we would like to write a contract with some RG and CG, which should be such that bad quality entrepreneurs are not going to prefer this contract over saying, yeah, sure, I'm bad. So we are asking for the so-called no mimicking constraint. The constraint which says bad types do not want to pose as good types, but rather prefer to say, well, let's just give me, so I admit being a bad type. So what does that mean? Well, if a bad type, let's call this the no mimicking constraint. So the bad type, if they do admit to being bad, they will happily get their RB. So let me just call this. So for the bad type, with full information, we would have the RB equals R minus I over Q, like I said, and the CB equals 0. We're going to look for an equilibrium in which the bad type admits being bad, saying, give me this contract, we'll both be fine. Just give me RB, which is R minus IQ, which is a lower R, and in return we don't talk further about this collateral. And you will break even, you lender, because this RB is a bit lower, so what remains for you, lender, is sufficient for you to break even without this lower, even in the presence of this lower probability of success Q. And what I get as a borrower is in that case Q times R minus I. So this is what you get if you just admit to being a bad type. We want this to be bigger than or equal to what you get if you mimic being a good type. So if you mimic being a good type, you say, well, I'm good, trust me. But the bank says, okay, well then you will get this higher RG upon success, but you also post this collateral CG. So what do you get in total? You are actually bad quality, so with quality Q you will succeed. You get the high RGs, that's nice. But with probability 1 minus Q, you will actually fail, and you pay up the CG. So this is going to be costly for you. If CG is big enough, it's going to be so costly that you actually do not like to mimic being a good type. You prefer just getting the QR minus I that you could get anyway by admitting being a low quality entrepreneur. So this is no mimicking constraint. This is what in particular the RG, the payoff for the good types, and the CG, the collateral for the good types, should satisfy this inequality in order to make sure that a bad type will never mimic a good type. So how can we make sure this is going to be valid? Well, we again use the fact that the really, since it will in equilibrium only be the good types who will be willing to actually offer this particular contract. Bad types don't want to mimic, the good types will want to accept this contract. If you're a lender, you know, if somebody is going to accept this contract, then it's really a good quality entrepreneur and I will get my money back with probability P times RG. So we still have this particular equation. The participation constraint for the lenders is still there. So the participation constraint for the lenders. So we know what PRG is, right? So PR minus PRG equals I, and therefore RG equals R minus I over P. So let's plug it in into our no mimicking constraint. So we're going to plug in RG, the required payment to the good type entrepreneur, inside this no mimicking constraint. We're going to make sure actually the no mimicking constraint in equilibrium is going to hold with equality. It's the best we can do essentially. So we're going to solve QR minus I, so no mimicking constraint is going to tell us QR minus I will be equal to Q times RG. Well, let's plug that in. Q times R minus Q over P times I, that's this bit, Q over P times I, minus this 1 minus Q times CG. So now you notice all these things here are parameters. The only thing that we do not yet know is what this CG, this collateral is that the good type needs to pose. But we can solve that, right? So how do we solve this? Well, first of all, let me just eliminate those two QRs that we have on both sides and then rearrange this equation to get 1 minus Q times CG equals 1 minus Q over P times I. And if you rewrite that, you will find that reduces to P minus Q divided by P times 1 minus Q times I. So what this says is, if we offer a contract, if we're a good type, if we're a good quality project with probability of success P, and we do offer a project which remunerates us nicely in terms of having a big RG, right? So the return upon success that's commensurate with the fact that our project is of a good type, that's nice, but we have to deter the bad quality borrowers from copying our contract, and the way that we can do this is by making it really unattractive for a bad borrower to pose as a good type by raising this collateral level CG to some positive amount, this particular positive amount, because that's going to make sure that there's no mimicking constraint that you have here is going to hold. So that with this, if CG is high enough, higher than this value, or at least higher as this value, then indeed the bad type will be better off by admitting being bad and just getting QR minus I. This particular contract that you would have with full information as well is going to be better, or at least as good, as mimicking a good type and getting the higher RG, but also getting the having to pay the higher collateral if he fails. So let's go back to the slide then. So here we have, first of all, again, the benchmark upon symmetric information. What does the optimal contract for you as if you are a good type look like? So you have symmetric information, no asymmetric, no information asymmetry, so everybody knows, lenders know you're a good type, so they will agree to pay you R minus I over P upon success, and they will also actually, there's no use for having this collateral. It's just inefficient and we don't need it. And similarly, the bad types will get the bad type R, so such that indeed still the lenders are going to break even and the collateral is going to be 0. So this set of contract I argued was not going to be in equilibrium if there's hidden information, so if the bank cannot verify whether you're good or bad as an entrepreneur, because in that case everybody would like to sort of get the higher RG than RB, and therefore pose as being a good type. So we would have pooling in the absence of any collateral. So what can we do about this? So we're not happy about this. If you're really a good type and we say, well, I can convince you that I'm good, I'm going to post some collateral. It's not worth much or not at all actually to the bank per se, but it's going to convince you that a really bad type entrepreneur would never want to copy my behavior. So that's basically what we say here. So I'm going to post some positive collateral CG so as to get this separating equilibrium. If still the bad borrowers, the bad quality borrowers are going to mimic in the sense of claiming to be good type, they will get a higher RG, but now they will also incur the loss of this CG. Instead, they can also say, well, yeah, sure, I'm bad, just give me the RB that sort of allows you to break even though I'm a bad entrepreneur, and that will leave the NPV of the project, QR minus I, to the bad type borrower. And so the no mimicking constraint is, well, the utility that the bad type gets from admitting being bad needs to be better, needs to be at least as good as the utility that they get if they pose or mimic to be a good type. So we had to again identify from the participation constraint, the lender's participation constraint, what RG is, and from the no mimicking constraint which is reproduced here, we can then reproduce what actually the CG, the collateral that you need to post, which is of this particular form that we just derived, is going to be. So with this particular combination, indeed, the bad types will be deterred from posing as a good type. So this is the math, the algebra basically, which does this. The important thing here is bad types are going to reveal being of bad type, just getting QR minus I because there's no need for this inefficient collateral. Good types do get their higher RG, the higher payoff upon success, but they will have to post this collateral, which in itself is inefficient because it's a loss to them, but not necessarily a gain directly, at least, to the bank, because the bank doesn't value this collateral. But they have to do this basically to convince the bank that they are of a good quality. So the good type gets the total NPV, but there's a loss here. There's a loss. There might be, even though you're good, you might fail. In that case, you will lose your collateral to the bank, but the bank doesn't value this. So this 1 minus P times CG is going to be the social waste, the inefficiency of posting this collateral. And this works, this splitting, this separation between good and bad types work, because posting such collateral is even more costly for the bad types who have a higher probability of failure than the good types have. So one might also, if you're sort of more inclined to pictures, we can also look at this solution essentially in a graph. So this graph says, well, we look at different contracts. A contract might have, will have some payoff to the borrower R, some collateral C. So the full information benchmark is going to be, well, we're posting no collateral, so C will be 0, both for the good types and bad types. And this point G here is that point with CG equals 0, and the big R, which is associated to the good type project. So you get a high payoff if you really have a good type. And that's what you get if you have full information, so no hidden information. That was this benchmark. So point G is the contract associated to the full information contract offered by the good types, whereas point B, the lower RB, of course a CB equal to 0, is what you would get on the full information if you're a bad type. Now, if the banks cannot distinguish these two types of firms, types of entrepreneurs, then of course, if you're a bad borrower, you're going to be enticed to actually pose as a good type, because this particular contract is going to give you a higher utility than your bad type contract that's over here. Why is that? Well, this big, thick black line is the indifference curve, so the curve of equal utility for the bad types, and you see that this particular contract lies above that line, so it's more attractive to bad types. So bad types will want to mimic the good types if the contract for the good type is above this black line. So what can you do if you're a good type? You don't want this mimicking. You want to convince the bank that you're actually a good type rather than a bad type. So what you'll do, you'll offer this separating contract. A contract which still gets you the RG, the big RG, but now at a higher CG. And the benefit of offering this higher CG is that the utility that a bad type would get from accepting this separating contract S is exactly the same as the contract that they would get if they just admit to being a bad type. The good type, on the other hand, will get still a higher utility than that, because their indifference curves for the good types are actually a bit less steep. So just to make the counterfactual here, if instead you offer a different contract as a good type contract with some lower collateral S prime, then still you see, well, this S prime contract will lie on a higher indifference curve, or an indifference curve associated to a higher surplus for the bad type, so still that would be preferred for the bad type. So it's the thick black line which you want to remain below, essentially. So the question that we tried to answer here was, so can we design some scheme such that indeed this good type entrepreneur can convince the lenders that they are good entrepreneurs, in other words, send a signal, a credible signal to the lenders that they are good? And yes, we can. So what does it look like? Good types will offer collateral which is going to be paid out to the investors if the project fails. And we have to make sure that this collateral is so large enough to make sure that bad entrepreneurs are not willing to copy that behavior. So they're not willing to mimic the good ones. That was this no mimicking constraint that we had a look at. Okay, so that was one example of signaling, dissipative signaling, in the sense dissipative meaning that something inefficient is going on here, the inefficiency being posting the collateral, whereas this collateral itself is worth more in the hands of the entrepreneur than for the bank, which doesn't actually value it in our example. So some value might be lost, in particular when the good type suffers failure, which is still possible. So it's inefficient, but it's necessary in order to sustain the separating equilibrium. So the next video will be about the second example, which is going to be called incomplete insurance, and which deals with actually IPOs. How do you convince new investors in your firm that you actually have information that this firm is going to do very well rather than be a bad type of firm? So we'll look at that in the next video.